Patricia felt that the one thing to do was to get rid of her aunt for the day and then think things over quietly and decide as to her plan of campaign. "Please, Aunt Adelaide," she said, "don't let's discuss it any more to-day. I've had such a worrying time at the Bonsors, and my head is so stupid. Come to tea to-morrow afternoon at 5:30, and I will tell you all, as they say in the novelettes. But for heaven's sake don't get talking to those dreadful old tabbies. They have no affairs of their own, and at the present moment they simply live upon mine." "Very well, Patricia," replied Miss Brent as she rose to go. "I will wait until to-morrow. But, understand me, I am your sole surviving relative, and I have a duty to perform by you. That duty I shall perform, whatever it costs me." As Patricia looked into the hard, cold eyes of her aunt, she believed her. At that moment Miss Brent looked as if she represented all the aggressive virtues in Christendom. "It's very sweet of you, Aunt Adelaide, and I very much appreciate your interest. I'm all nervy to-day, but I shall be all right to-morrow. Don't forget, 5:30 here. That will give me time to get back from the Bonsors." Miss Brent pecked Patricia's right cheek and moved towards the door. "Remember, Patricia," she said as a final shot, "to-morrow I shall expect a full explanation. I am deeply concerned about you. I cannot conceive what your poor dear father would have said had he been alive." With this parting shot Miss Brent moved down the staircase and left Galvin House. As she stalked to the Temperance Hotel in Bloomsbury, where she was staying, she was fully satisfied that she had done her duty as a woman and a Christian. "Sole surviving relative," muttered Patricia as she turned back after seeing her aunt out. And then she remembered with a smile that her father had once said that relatives were the very devil. A softness came into her eyes at the thought of her father, and she remembered another saying of his. "When you lose your sense of humour and your courage at the same time, you have lost the game." For a moment Patricia paused, deliberating what she would do. Finally she walked to the telephone at the end of the hall. There was a grimness about her look indicative of a set purpose. Taking down the receiver, she called Gerard 60,000. There was a pause. "That the Quadrant Hotel?" she inquired. "Is Lord Peter Bowen in?" The clerk would inquire. Patricia waited what seemed an age. At last a voice cried, "Hello?" "Is that Lord Peter Bowen?" "Is that you, Patricia?" came the reply from the other end of the wire. "Oh, so it's true then," said Patricia. "What's true?" queried Bowen at the other end. "What I've just said." "What do you mean? I don't understand." "I must see you this evening," said Patricia in an even voice. "That's most awfully good of you." "It's nothing of the sort." Bowen laughed. "Shall I come round?" "No." "Will you dine with me?" "No." "Well, where shall I see you?" Patricia thought for a moment. "I will meet you at Lancaster Gate Tube at 20 minutes to 9." "All right, I'll be there. Shall I bring the car?" For a moment Patricia hesitated. She did not want to go to a restaurant with him. She wanted merely to talk and see how she was to get out of the difficulty with Aunt Adelaide. The car seemed to offer a solution. They could drive out to some quiet place and then talk without a chance of being overheard. "Yes, please, I think that will do admirably." "Mind you bring a thick coat. Won't you let me pick you up? Please do, then you can bring a fur coat and all that sort of thing, you know." Again Patricia hesitated for a moment. "Perhaps that would be the better way," she conceded grudgingly. "Right-o. Will 8:30 do?" "Yes, I'll be ready." "It's awfully kind of you. I'm frightfully bucked." "You'd better wait and see, I think," was Patricia's grim retort. "Good-bye." "Au revoir." Patricia put the receiver up with a jerk. She returned to her room conscious that she was never able to do herself justice with Bowen. Her most righteous anger was always in danger of being dissipated when she spoke to him. His personality seemed to radiate good nature, and he always appeared so genuinely glad to see her, or hear her voice, that it placed her at a disadvantage. She ought to be stronger and more tenacious of purpose, she told herself. It was weak to be so easily influenced by someone else, especially a man who treated her in the way that Bowen had treated her, for Patricia had now come to regard herself as extremely ill-used. Nothing, she told herself, would have persuaded her to ring up Bowen in the way she had done, had it not been for Aunt Adelaide. In her heart she had to confess that she was very much afraid of Aunt Adelaide and what she might do. Patricia dreaded dinner that evening. She knew instinctively that everybody would be full of Miss Wangle's discovery. She might have known that Miss Wangle would not be satisfied until she had discovered everything there was to be discovered about Bowen. As Patricia walked along the hall to the staircase, Mrs. Hamilton came out of the lounge. Patricia put her arm round the fragile waist of the old lady, and they walked upstairs together. "Well," said Patricia gaily, "what are the old tabbies doing this afternoon?" "My dear," expostulated Mrs. Hamilton gently, "you mustn't call them that. They have so very little to interest them that "Oh, you dear funny little thing," said Patricia, giving Mrs. Hamilton a squeeze which almost lifted her off her feet. "I think you would find an excuse for anyone, no matter how wicked. When I get very, very bad, I shall come and ask you to explain me to myself. I think if you had your way, you would prove every wolf a sheep underneath. Come into my room and have a powwow." Inside her room, Patricia lifted Mrs. Hamilton bodily onto the bed. "Now lie there, you dear little thing, and have a rest. Dad used to say that every woman ought to lie on her back for 2 hours each day. I don't know why. I suppose it was to keep her quiet and get her out of the way. In any case, you have got to lie down there." "But your bed, my dear," protested Mrs. Hamilton. "Never mind my bed. You just do as you're told. Now, what are the old cats, I beg your pardon, what have the lambs been saying?" Mrs. Hamilton smiled in spite of herself. "Well, of course, dear, we're all very interested to hear that you're engaged to Lord Peter Bowen." "How did they find out?" interrupted Patricia. "Well, it appears that Miss Wangle has a friend who has a cousin in the War Office." "Oh dear," groaned Patricia. "I believe Miss Wangle has a friend who has a cousin in every known place in the world, and a good many unknown places," she added. "She's got a bishop in heaven, innumerable connections in Mayfair, acquaintances at court, cousins of friends at the War Office. The only place where she seems to have nobody who has anybody else is hell." "My dear," said Mrs. Hamilton in horror, "you mustn't talk like that." "But isn't it true?" persisted Patricia. "Well, I'm sorry if I've shocked you. Tell me all about it." "Well," began Mrs. Hamilton, "soon after you had gone out, Miss Wangle's friend telephoned in reply to her letter of inquiry. She told her all about Lord Peter Bowen, how he had distinguished himself in France, won the Military Cross, the D.S.O., how he had been promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and brought back to the War Office and given a position on the General Staff. He's a very clever young man, my dear." Patricia laughed outright at Mrs. Hamilton's earnestness. "Why, of course he's clever, otherwise he wouldn't have taken up with such a clever young woman." "Well, my dear, I hope he'll be happy," said Mrs. Hamilton earnestly. "I doubt it," said Patricia. "Doubt it?" There was horror in Mrs. Hamilton's voice. She half raised herself on the bed. Patricia pushed her back again. "Never mind. Your remark reminds me of a story about a great-great-grandmother of mine. A granddaughter of hers had become engaged, and there was a great family meeting to introduce the poor victim to his future in-laws. The old lady was very deaf, and had formed the habit of speaking aloud, quite unconscious that others could hear her. The wretched young man was brought up and presented, and everybody was agog to hear the grandmotherly pronouncement. She looked at the young man keenly and deliberately, whilst he stood the picture of discomfort, and turning to her granddaughter, said, 'Well, my dear, I hope you'll be happy. I hope you'll be very happy.' Then to herself, in an equally loud voice, she added, 'But he wouldn't have been my choice. He wouldn't have been my choice.'" "Oh, the poor dear," said Mrs. Hamilton, seeing only the tragic side of the situation. Patricia laughed. "How like you, you dear little grey lady," and she bent down and kissed the pale cheeks, bringing a slight rose flush to them. It was 7:30 before Mrs. Hamilton left Patricia's room. "Heigh-ho," sighed Patricia, as she undid her hair. "I suppose I shall have to run the gauntlet during dinner." Chapter 6